shows that the last decade, 2011 to 2020, was the warmest on record, as concentrations of greenhouse gases increased, oceans warming and rising, and severe weather like droughts, floods, wildfires and cyclones became all too commonplace.
The cause is clear. Anthropogenic climate change, climate disruption caused by human activities, human decisions and human folly. And the effects are disastrous. The data in this report should alarm us all. 2020 was 1.2 degrees Celsius hotter than pre-industrial times. We are getting dangerously close to the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that was set by the scientific community. We are on the verge of the abyss.
US President Joe Biden will convene world leaders on Thursday and Friday, representing some of the world's largest economies in his boldest effort yet to re-engage with the rest of the world following 4 years of increased unilateralism under his predecessor, with a clear expectation that leaders will present clear commitments to reduce their carbon emissions footprint. The UN is clear that net zero emissions must be met by 2050 by replacing polluting coal and oil-fired power stations with new technologies.
China-US cooperation is vital. It was vital for the Paris Agreement. It remains vital today, together with other important partners. I mean, all the big emitters are members of the G20, and obviously the G20 is an important forum where they need to come together. And we need to make sure that there are very ambitious commitments. We see this summit that will take place this week as an opportunity for a number of countries that have not yet announced what their national determined contributions will be or what their increased ambition will be to take profit of the summit to do so. Obviously, whatever the United States will be able to say, whatever other countries will be able to say, will be vital.
The World Meteorological Organization believes that there is a growing likelihood the average global temperature will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2024, at the very least temporarily, and with devastating consequences.
Adaptation remains very important because this negative trend in climate will anyhow continue until 2060s, and that means growing amount of drought problems in some parts of the world and growing amount of flooding problems in other parts of the world. And in the UN, we are just building a consortium for Sustainable Development Goal 6 implementation, that we would handle these water resource issue in a more solid way. And especially the less developed countries don't have enough means for handling the water crisis.
President Cyril Ramaphosa will be among the 40 world leaders to participate at the White House Leaders Summit on Climate later this week. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
All right, let's talk about this upcoming summit further with Sherwin joining us live. Sherwin, thank you as always. So this is about the US re-engaging after Washington withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord in 2017. That was quite spectacular. But it sounds like this is also about creating a global consensus to highlight the importance of this moment now.
There are a number of factors at play here. You know, this is very personal for the Biden administration, given the work that was done in the Obama-Biden administration, that, you know, dating back to the days of COP17 in Durban, South Africa, to the conclusion of those negotiations that led to the Paris Climate Change Accord in 2015. This is very much about unfinished business. I don't think Joe Biden was very pleased with Donald Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Change Accord in 2017, and so is reasserting the White House, the position that he has now, the power and leverage that he has back into the Paris Climate Change Accord. And really, this is also, Francis, about U.S. leadership in the world. This was President Biden speaking to this very issue in February this year. Watch.
On day one, I signed the paperwork to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. We're taking steps led by an example of integrating climate objectives across all of our diplomacy and raising the ambition of our climate targets. That way we can challenge other nations, other major emitters, up the ante on their own commitments. I'll be hosting a Climate Leaders Summit to address the climate crisis on Earth Day of this year. America must lead in the face of this existential threat. And just as with the pandemic, it requires global cooperation.
And just like with the pandemic, Francis, it requires global cooperation. The concern here is that there has been a lack of urgency as it relates to the pandemic that existed before COVID-19. Before we could say coronavirus, there was a climate change pandemic, and the level of ambition that you've seen from countries around the world vis-a-vis that World Meteorological report that we've just been talking about has not met the moment. We need to have an invigorated response on the levels that we are seeing in terms of the global response towards the COVID-19 pandemic.
And maybe money sometimes has something to do with that, Sherwin. Just tell us about financing as a stumbling block, because we know that the richer, more industrial nations, the big emitters, are often called upon to help mitigate efforts in poorer economies, the ones that often bear the brunt of climate change.
Francis, there's terminology we often hear, particularly from the developing world. It's called common but differentiated responsibilities. We all have a common role to play in terms of climate change mitigation, but our responsibilities are also different in terms of the financing, in particular, given the disparities between who created this problem and where the problem lies now. So what they did as part of the Paris Climate Change Accord was to create the Green Climate Fund, a fund that needed to be capitalized to the tune of $100 billion by the year 2020. They failed to reach the $100 billion target in the first year that $100 billion was meant to be reached. Of course, it has to be reached on an annual basis. This is something the UN Secretary General also addressed at the launch of that report yesterday. Let's watch.
Subsidies to polluting fossil fuels must be shifted to renewable energy. Developed countries must lead in phasing out coal by 2030 in OECD countries and 2040 elsewhere. No new coal power plants should be built. And countries should also work to ensure a just transition where opportunities outweigh job loss. According to International Labour Organization, 25 million jobs can be created in a green transition with only 7 million lost. Developed countries also need to deliver on climate finance for the developing world, particularly the promise of $100 billion per year. Of all climate finance from donors and multilateral national development banks must flow to resilience and adaptation from a much lower level of 20% today. This is necessary to protect our societies, especially in the developing world, from the disastrous weather and climate events that are here to stay.
There's also terminology called national determined contributions, an acronym NDC that you'll hear often during this summit in terms of what individual countries, Francis, are going to do in terms of bringing down their greenhouse gas emissions. The UN is talking about net zero emissions by 2050. Of course, some countries still have, coal-powered stations that are still in the development phase. South Africa's draft proposals on this national determined contributions is that South Africa will need about $8 billion annually by 2030, Francis, to meet adaptation and mitigation needs. That number is currently at around $2 billion. Question is, where is that money going to come from? And can they get the Green Climate Fund up to the $100 billion it needs to be capitalized at on an ongoing basis, supposedly to have started in 2020?
All right, well, please follow that summit upcoming for us. Thank you very much, as always, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Now,